Welcome to the Interstellar Age. Season 2, Not Alone. Episode 9, The Frontier Wars, Part 2, 2271 to 2272. As Commodore Rodrigo Dahl assembled the Summit Fleet to liberate New Columbia, not all wildcatter voices were united behind him. Several of the smaller colonies wanted to wait for help from the TIU, but messengers had already been dispatched to ask Earth for assistance, and the response would take weeks to arrive. Besides which, there was little chance that response would be positive. The other voice urging restraint was that of Rance Wolfe, CEO of Starbird Interstellar and Armada Defense Industries. Wolfe had previously urged a more aggressive response to the raids. Now he argued that the Chiron deployment at New Columbia must be a trap, that rushing in to save the beleaguered colony would only serve the enemy's ends. Instead, the Summit Fleet should be cautious, probe the Chiron's defenses, try to spring whatever trap might be laid without committing their full force. Wolfe's apparent contrarianism was beginning to grate on his fellow delegates, despite the high regard in which he had once been held. Dahl and his supporters were not inclined to wait. Data from reconnaissance skiffs continued to flow in, showing the horrors of the Chiron occupation in vivid detail. Daily, colonists were being tortured and used as slave labor to construct defenses and bizarre monuments. Most horrifically, entire families were frequently torn apart and eaten alive, children before their parents, husbands and wives in front of one another. Wolfe argued that this might be a conscious effort on the part of the aliens to be as frightful as possible, to cow and terrify the population, and to goad the Summit into battle. If that was the Chiron's intent, it worked. Dahl ordered the Summit Fleet to make for New Columbia as soon as it assembled. On paper, the Summit Fleet was indeed impressive. At nearly 100 vessels, it was the largest single assemblage of human warships in space up to that point, and it dwarfed the reinforced Chiron squadron of just 20 ships. But those impressive numbers belied a core weakness. Only 25 of the fleet's vessels were purpose-built warships, most of them brand new and largely untested. The rest were armed merchant ships, and most of these barely fit the armed descriptor. Around a third of the fleet was nothing more than small haulers with a single large-caliber cannon and a few point defense turrets attached. Still, Dahl believed that overwhelming numbers, tactical initiative, and superior gunnery would win the day. Wolfe was not so sure. Despite disagreeing with the mission, he volunteered to lead a contingent of his own ships in person. By 2271, Wolfe commanded about 20 well-armed vessels, mostly refitted merchantmen like his old flagship Peregrine, but these were much better refits than the Wildcatter standard. He also had 4 newly constructed warships of his own company's design, 2 destroyers, the Victory and the Drake, and 2 heavy cruisers, the Howard and the Lepanto. All 4 ships were designed to employ the new Avenger anti-ship missile as their primary armament, with secondary armaments of large-caliber railguns and PDTs in the case of the cruisers, and PDTs alone in the case of the destroyers. With a limited number of Avengers available, due to ramping up production lines, Wolfe preferred to keep the 4 warships well-stocked, rather than spreading the missiles out among his other vessels. His merchantman frigates were armed with MAC batteries and conventional missiles. This made Wolfe's force one of the largest and most heavily armed contingents, second only to the official Republic Navy led by Dahl. But Dahl rejected Wolfe's offer to join the fleet. Instead, he bestowed on him the honor of remaining at Frontier to defend the home system, in case the aliens should take advantage of the battle to launch a raid there. In reality, Dahl detested Wolfe, both personally and professionally, a feeling which was increasingly mutual. He feared, probably correctly, that Wolfe intended to ignore his orders once engaged, in order to put his own theories to the test. Thus, Dahl chose to exclude Wolfe's Avenger-armed warships from the battle, keeping his gun line and his doctrine intact. But Starbird could not simply sit out the operation. Wolfe was loath to split up his well-trained force, but asked for 2 of his frigates to volunteer to serve with Dahl. Several answered the call, and he chose 2 from among them, including Peregrine, to join the fleet. Dahl's Summit fleet departed at the beginning of September 2271, arriving at New Columbia 10 days later. Long-range reconnaissance pinpointed most of the alien squadron in synchronous orbit over the colony world, with a handful of smaller picket vessels further out. Dahl wanted to maximize his time on target with long-range fire, while minimizing the danger to the colony from missed shots. MAC rounds missing space targets and crashing into the ground could do terrible damage there. Dahl planned the fleet's course so it would make the final deceleration from star drive about 100,000 kilometers from the planet, oriented such that the Chiron fleet would be directly ahead of them, with the planet below and open space behind. Dahl split the fleet into 5 squadrons, with all the warships in one group of 12 and one of 13, echeloned at the center, maximizing their firepower. 3 mixed groups of armed merchantmen provided cover, 2 forward, 1 in reserve, prepared to react to another ambush like the one the aliens employed in the previous battle. The warship's heavy railguns opened fire moments after the fleet decelerated from star drive. The fleet conserved a high initial velocity, about 50 kilometers per second. In those days, the maximum velocity of a high-powered railgun was also about 50 kilometers a second, giving the rounds a combined velocity of over 100 kilometers per second, with a massive kinetic energy behind them. But even at that speed, the projectiles would take about 15 minutes to reach their targets, decreasing geometrically with each volley as the human ships closed with the Chirons. Dahl hoped to take the enemy by surprise and score some initial hits, as at safe harbor. Then he expected the aliens would turn and charge towards his fleet. Only this time, massive and concentrated firepower should be able to overcome the aliens' armor and maneuver advantages and destroy them as they closed. Instead, the Chiron ships fled the moment they detected Dahl, avoiding the initial volleys and orbiting to use the planet as cover. Dahl changed course, diving down in a wide arc and hoping to take the aliens as they came around the other side of the world. But the aliens never emerged. It soon became clear they were using sensor data from picket ships, standing off at range to track Dahl's fleet and keep the planet between them. To force the enemy into battle, Dahl would either have to use the planet to cover his advance, then come at them around the curve, engaging them at close range, the last thing he wanted and exactly what the aliens seemed to, or he could split his main force into 2 or 3 parts and pincer the enemy at long range. But he was reluctant to do this as well, in case there was an ambush waiting to be sprung. Finally, he could attempt to run down and destroy or chase off the picket ships, then take the enemy main force at will. Dahl chose the third course, splitting off 3 squadrons of 4 armed merchantmen to chase down the 3 picket vessels in high orbit. His main force remained well clear of the planet, waiting for the enemy main force to re-emerge or flee, and dispatching recon drones to keep tabs on them. Predictably, the picket ships did not sit around and wait to be destroyed. They fled in 3 different directions, arcing their courses to keep in comms range of the main fleet, and dodging MAC rounds all the way. The merchantmen struggled to keep up. After 30 to 40 minutes of fruitless pursuit, Dahl realized he would not be able to destroy the pickets without committing his faster, better-armed warships to the chase. He settled now on a new tactic: chase the picket ships far enough away that sensor picture and light lag would become a problem, then make his move against the alien main force, using the signal delay to mask his movements until it was too late. In order to pull that off, he would have to get closer to New Columbia and split his main force in 2, but only at the last possible moment. Dahl made the nav preparations and ordered his fleet closer to the planet. The pursuit squadrons adopted loose formations to chase their quarry as far away from the planet as possible, so that in order to turn or curve back, they would have to expose themselves to lethal fire. Once the picket ships were 4 to 5 light minutes from New Columbia, creating a signal lag of 8 to 10 minutes, Dahl struck. He split his force into 2 large battle groups and burned hard around the planet on divergent courses, hoping to come upon the alien fleet at the same time and bracket it with powerful MAC fire. The maneuver was well executed, especially given the inexperience of the crews with flying in formation. It might have worked perfectly, had not the enemy had plans of their own. The Chirons appear to have had a second force of about 20 warships waiting at one of New Columbia's Lagrangian points. Powered down almost to zero, they would have been all but invisible to anything but active scan at relatively close range. They had likely been waiting for Dahl's fleet, or a large portion of it, to enter New Columbia's gravitic threshold. They would have been aware of the gravitic tolerances of human star drives, having been reverse engineering them for the last 2 decades. Once they saw Dahl's forces cross this invisible line and begin their attack, the ambush squadron powered up and executed a micro-jump, a process which would have taken several minutes, just barely long enough for the radiation to reach Dahl's ships before they struck. The Chiron ambush force concentrated on the largest of Dahl's 2 battle groups, commanded by the Commodore himself. Decelerating just outside the gravitic threshold, only a few thousand kilometers directly above Dahl's force, they took him completely by surprise, just as the Chiron main body came into range. To his credit, Dahl kept his force together and concentrated on the enemy to his front, on whom he could bring the most firepower to bear. He relied on his second battle group to alter course and engage the ambush force above them, hopefully taking it in the side as it engaged Dahl from behind. But the ambush force merely launched a massive swarm of fighters and drones to attack Dahl from the rear. Then it turned to engage the second battle group. The battle rapidly devolved into a melee at ranges of 2,000 kilometers or less. This placed the human ships at a marked disadvantage. The crews of the merchantmen were excellent ship handlers, but not fighting sailors. Certainly not well trained enough to fight their ships to the last, or form scratch squadrons with other half-trained crews from different colonies in the midst of a confused melee. Their formations were broken. Chiron plasma weapons and torpedoes wreaked havoc at close range, sowing terror by their high-tech violence, melting hulls and men alike. The merchant majority of the fleet dissolved almost immediately, many being destroyed as they tried to flee the gravity well. The small corps of wildcat warships now found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. These fought bravely and tenaciously against the enemy, holding formation as best they could, and demonstrating that their long, obsessive drilling and gunnery had not entirely been for naught. 5 Chiron warships were destroyed, and several more severely damaged in the close-range brawl. But once the trap was sprung, the outcome was never really in doubt. Dahl's flagship, the Philippine Sea, was destroyed with all hands as it charged into the enemy formation, drawing fire so the rest of the fleet could fight their way into open space. But none of the 25 warships Dahl brought to the battle escaped. All were either destroyed, captured, or crashed into the planet. Wolfe's Peregrine, leading one of the merchantman pursuit squadrons, sacrificed itself as well, charging toward the Chiron picket ship as hunted became hunter, and engaging it at close range so the other 3 ships in its group could escape to Stardrive. In all, 11 ships out of 100 escaped the Second Battle of New Columbia. To this day, the engagement remains one of the deadliest space battles in history in terms of number and proportion of human ships destroyed, at 89%. When news of the catastrophe reached Frontier, the panic was fueled by the long-awaited response from the TIU. The Terrans promised to do everything in their power to prevent further alien attacks, by making diplomatic contact with them and negotiating an end to the conflict. Recent immigrants to freedom clamored to flee back to the TIU or the corporate worlds on the few ships available. Wolfe's ships and a handful of other armed merchantmen were now Frontier's only line of defense. Fortunately, one of the few people not panicking was Rance Wolfe. While the situation was dire, he saw something in the battle at New Columbia that gave him cause for hope. Despite facing a much larger force, the Chirons only committed about 40 ships to the attack. That might indicate that this was, if not the entirety of their fleet, the greater portion of it. With 5 ships destroyed and several more badly damaged, that force would be weakened. Second, the Chirons did everything they could to force an engagement at close range. Clearly, long-range firepower had been largely ineffective for both sides, but the Chirons' strong desire to avoid a medium-range fight, where max would be more effective, likely indicated that they believed Dahl's force had the advantage at that range. If humans could force a medium-range engagement, they might stand a better chance of success. Third, the Avenger could provide an element of tactical surprise that might help even the odds in a future battle. Even captured sailors from Dahl's fleet would have expressed little confidence in the Avenger if they knew about it at all. This gave Wolf confidence that if he could force a battle between his fleet and the alien ships, he might well be victorious. But at that point, the summit was effectively dead. With Dahl killed or captured and his strategy discredited, the military arm of the group had no leadership and no direction, and political will was evaporating fast. The remaining colonial contingents were either preparing to head home to defend their own colonies or had already left. But Wolf was intent on seizing the strategic initiative and striking the aliens somewhere, alone if necessary, rather than waiting for them to attack another colony. In addition to exposing another planet to the aliens' depredations, that would make it that much harder to force the battle on Wolf's terms. So, he would attack. The question was, where? Heading back to New Columbia for a third time could be the last thing the aliens would expect, or it could be suicide. The aliens were clearly prepared to defend the conquered planet. Then, Alyssa Thorson, Wolf's chief engineer at Starboard, noticed something. The intel from Locke suggested that the aliens had not, at that time, possessed FTL capability. That meant they had likely acquired star drive from Locke and the other raided colonies and reverse-engineered it. That had already been surmised. Indeed, Wolf had used that information to support his theory that the aliens didn't have many more ships readily available, since they might have a limited number of star drives to power them. But Thorson now pointed out that none of the destroyed alien ships suffered matter-antimatter containment failures. All available sensor data pointed to them using nuclear fusion reactors, which meant that they could not have directly copied antimatter-powered human star drives. Earlier fusion-powered human star drives required frequent refueling, and they were purpose-built for nuclear power. A matter-antimatter star drive, reverse-engineered to fusion power, would likely have even higher fuel requirements. Thorson suggested figuring out where the aliens might stop to refuel between New Columbia and Frontier and laying an ambush there. But there was no way of knowing the specific range of the Chiron drives without being able to examine them, their reactors, and their navigation systems. That would make the task of figuring out where and when an enemy fleet would stop to refuel almost impossible, and it involved waiting for the enemy to launch their own attack, handing the strategic initiative back. But Thorson's revelation presented another opportunity. Since the aliens still had not abandoned the system following the destruction of Dahl's fleet, Wolf suggested that they were intending to use New Columbia as a forward base, a staging ground for future attacks against other wildcat systems. If so, they would need a source of nuclear fuel in the New Columbia system. If Wolf's team could determine what kind of fuel their drives used, they could figure out where in the system the aliens would need to set up a mining and refueling operation. Then Wolf's squadron could hit that target, hopefully drawing an enemy force into battle to protect it, and then destroy them too. Not being saddled with older, slower cargo haulers, Wolf's small fleet was faster than Dahl's, but it was still a 5-day journey each way to New Columbia. A Chiron fleet could be on the way to Frontier as they spoke. The destruction of the colony would doom the whole wildcat sector, and potentially open up the rest of human space to invasion. But the fact was this: if the aliens came to Frontier with all their strength and forced a battle on their terms, Wolf would probably be defeated and the colony destroyed. An attack was their only chance to change the game, and it had to be launched now. Still, Frontier could not be left completely defenseless. Wolf convinced the Republic to reconvene what was left of the summit one last time. Marshalling all of his persuasive power, he was able to convince a handful of the other members to commit a force to defend the planet while his fleet was gone. Such a small squadron would have no chance of defeating the enemy main fleet, but they might be able to deter or destroy a raid. With the defense in place, Wolf felt his best chance at victory was to strike while the aliens were still regrouping and reorganizing. This necessitated leaving without waiting for more of his own ships or Avenger missiles to be completed, and without a target being selected. There would be no time to reconnoiter the system before departing, meaning the mining or refueling facility would have to be located en route. Wolf's fleet departed on September 26, 2271. Poring over the data from previous engagements, Thorson theorized that the aliens used a hybrid deuterium-tritium helium-3 reactor. That would mean that they would need a source of both helium-3 and lithium, the former as the catalyzing fuel, the latter to breed tritium in the reactor. They would also need deuterium, but this they could easily procure from the seawater on New Columbia. There were a number of sites in the system from which either tritium or helium-3 could be easily obtained, but there was only one where they could both be obtained, a gas giant in the outer system which the colonists had named Skyfather. The planet bore a strong resemblance to Jupiter, a large gas giant with a number of prominent storms and a large number of moons. Several of these moons were known to have large, easily accessible lithium deposits, making for easy mining, while the atmosphere at its northern polar region was an ideal source of helium-3. This would make the planet an efficient place to set up a mining and fuel processing outpost, well away from any prying eyes watching the colony world. Wolf decelerated his fleet several light days from the planet, above the plane of the system. Via telescope, he saw clear evidence of mining and processing facilities being established around Skyfather. Given the level of development at the time the light departed the system, it seemed likely that the facilities would by now be at least partially operational, and that they were at that time defended only by a few picket ships. But a force of 12 alien warships was in orbit of New Columbia, about 30 light minutes from Skyfather. If Wolf's squadron conducted a perfect ambush, they would have half an hour to destroy the facilities before the aliens could react. If a picket ship or skiff was able to escape using star drive, reinforcements would arrive that much faster. Wolf planned the attack carefully before ordering the final jumps to Skyfather. He split his force into 3 attack squadrons, one for the helium-3 mines at the planetary pole, the other 2 aimed at hunting down and destroying the picket ships before they could escape. Wolf commanded the fleet from the Lepanto, which led the main body along with Howard, while Drake and Victory each led one of the pursuit groups. All 4 warships were ordered to employ only guns and conventional missiles in the initial engagement, conserving all their Avengers until Wolf's explicit order. Wolf's initial barrage wrecked the orbiting helium-3 mine and destroyed 2 of the unprepared picket ships, but a third escaped, while the 2 remaining engaged the pursuit squadrons to hold them off. Realizing he had just minutes before enemy reinforcements arrived, Wolf ordered a long-range Mach volley fired at the lithium mines on the lunar surfaces, while his 3 squadrons converged into echelon to meet the expected attack. They remained well inside the massive planet's gravitic threshold, which would force enemy reinforcements to jump in at range, then close at sublight. Wolf hoped the aliens would rush in immediately to avoid the destruction of their strategic facilities rather than waiting to set up an ambush or flanking attack as they had against Dahl. This time the Chirons obliged. After decelerating, they charged in to attack Wolf head-on, possibly emboldened by the fact that most of the fleet was armed merchant ships, whose capabilities in a stand-up fight they had recently learned to disdain. This Wolf had also been counting on. As the range closed and volleys were exchanged, Wolf unleashed the Avengers. At first, the Chirons did not even deploy their missile defense interceptors, probably due to the Avengers' wide parabolic courses. Only once the missiles turned in toward their targets did the Chirons launch interceptors. By then, it was too late. The first volley of Avengers detonated in an almost perfect bracketing attack. X-ray lasers speared several of the ships on the edges of the dagger-shaped Chiron formation, penetrating their weaker side and ventral armor and doing severe internal damage. Still, the Chirons came on. Now wise to the Avenger, they launched drones and fighters to form a defensive bubble in the hopes of intercepting the second volley further out, before the missiles could detonate. This defense was largely successful, but Wolf's third volley, Avengers mixed with conventional payload and nuclear-tipped missiles, wrought havoc. The nuclear warheads detonated ahead of the others, creating interference and detonating some of the interceptors to allow Avengers to get into optimal range. Peppered by Mach rounds from ahead and high-powered anti-ship lasers from the flanks, crippled and dying Chiron vessels began to fall out of formation. But by then, the fleet was well within the gravitic threshold of Skyfather, and they chose to continue their now suicidal attack. A handful of Chiron ships managed to make it into close range with Wolf. 2 of the armed merchantmen, Kuribayashi and House Undivided, were destroyed, while the Drake was badly damaged. But the Chiron squadron was obliterated. Most of their fighters and drones had already been expended attempting to intercept the Avengers. The remainder were easy pickings for starboard PDTs. In all, 14 Chiron warships were destroyed or rendered inoperable. Wolfe elected not to remain long enough to attempt to capture one of the vessels, or to pursue the few that fled back to New Columbia. At least 20 more alien warships were somewhere out there, and Wolfe's squadron was fresh out of Avengers. Instead, he recovered escape pods from the 2 destroyed ships and nuked the wrecks, then completed the destruction of the alien mining and fuel processing facilities and headed back to Frontier at top speed. The lopsided victory in the Battle of Skyfather, more commonly known today as the Third Battle of New Columbia, instantly restored hope to the terrified wildcat colonies and established Wolfe's reputation as an ingenious naval strategist and bold tactician. Word of the surprising victory spread through the colonies and the rest of human space. Most outside observers had written off the wildcatters. The TIU had been prepared to liberate the colonies by negotiation with the presumably misguided aliens. Indeed, some less scrupulous Terran politicians saw the war as an opportunity to gain control of the wayward and impetuous wildcatters. The salvation, however temporary, that the victory provided did not move the TIU powers that be. The Prime Minister urged restraint to allow time for diplomacy to work, despite the fact that no successful contacts with the aliens had yet been established. Sensing an opportunity, Surya Offworld pledged a raft of military supplies to aid the wildcat colonies in their defense. While most of these would not arrive until after the Great Crisis had passed, the gesture alone was greatly appreciated by the struggling wildcatters. In the aftermath of the victory, Wolfe was unanimously elected as the military leader of the summit, or what was left of it, gaining command of all their military forces. But what to do with them? He still had no idea where the aliens' home base might be. After the defeat at Skyfather, the alien space forces abandoned New Columbia. Wolfe was under no illusions that this meant they intended to leave humanity alone. After all, they left a substantial ground force to maintain the occupation of the colony. Based on what he'd seen so far, Wolfe believed the aliens were simply withdrawing their fleet to regroup before launching another attack, this one aimed directly at their enemy's center of gravity, Frontier. But with their forward base destroyed, it would take time for the aliens to prepare for an operation of that scope. That in turn should give the wildcatters space to build and arm more ships and come up with a plan of battle. Wolfe and his staff, with assistance and assessments of enemy capabilities from a newly designed tactical AI, developed a multi-layered deception plan to offset the aliens' advantages in firepower and tactical initiative. Wolfe also had to assume that the aliens were either observing Frontier, and likely Horizon as well, or would make use of light-day reconnaissance stops on the way in to assess defensive preparations, much as he had done before Skyfather. It would be difficult to surprise an enemy who could see every step Wolfe took to prepare for his arrival. But Wolfe was confident he could find a way.